Hello. Settle in comfortably, wrap yourself up warmly, and let the gentle whisper of stories carry you into a deep, peaceful sleep. Our journey tonight transports us to a peculiar intersection of American history, the 1930s, a decade defined by economic hardship and sweeping societal changes. It was also a period ripe for anxieties to take root, nurtured by misinformation and fear. This is the era in which we find the genesis of one of the most infamous propaganda films ever created, Reefer Madness. Before Reefer Madness became a cult classic or a cautionary tale, it was a potent weapon in a campaign of fear against a plant that for centuries had coexisted with humanity. In 1937, the US Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalizing marijuana at the federal level. This wasn't merely a legislative act. It was the culmination of years of targeted lobbying and public relations efforts, spearheaded by figures like Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger, armed with sensationalized newspaper articles and dubious expert testimonials, painted a dire picture of marijuana's effects, linking it to violence, madness, and moral decay. The groundwork for Reefer Madness was meticulously laid. Imagine standing in the bustling streets of 1936, where whispers of a new, terrifying drug called marijuana, a term deliberately chosen to instill foreignness and fear, permeated public discourse. Editorials warned of murder weed and its supposed power to turn respectable citizens into homicidal maniacs. Scientific understanding of cannabis was, at best, rudimentary, and at worst, completely ignored in favor of alarmist narratives. For instance, Anslinger famously cited Dr. James C. Munch as his expert, a pharmacologist whose research was later widely discredited, but whose testimonies at congressional hearings dramatically fueled the anti-marijuana sentiment. Munch, under oath, claimed marijuana users developed temporary insanity and would kill their brother and then their sister. These unfounded assertions, delivered with academic authority, were instrumental in shaping public opinion and policy. Reefer Madness, originally titled Tell Your Children, emerged from this climate of manufactured hysteria. Produced in 1936 by Dwayne Esper, a director known for exploitation films, it was initially intended as a morality tale to be shown to parents by a church group. However, it was later acquired by notorious propaganda producer George Hurleman, recut, and given its more provocative title to capitalize on the burgeoning reefer panic. The film's narrative, though melodramatic, effectively concentrated the prevailing fears of the time into a visceral, cinematic experience, promising a direct link between marijuana use and a descent into madness, promiscuity, and violence. It wasn't just a movie, it was a reflection, albeit a distorted one, of a national anxiety, magnified and broadcast for maximum impact. The potent aroma of fear, carefully distilled and packaged, was about to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting American public. The economic depression of the 1930s created fertile ground for scapegoating and moral panics. With widespread unemployment and social unrest, the average American sought simple answers to complex problems. Into this vacuum stepped not only Harry Anslinger's sensationalized rhetoric, but also the anxieties surrounding cultural change and the influx of Mexican immigrants, who were often associated with marijuana use. Before its federal prohibition, marijuana had a long, varied history in the United States. Cannabis was an everyday ingredient in many patent medicines of the 19th and early 20th centuries, marketed for ailments ranging from migraines to menstrual cramps. Companies like Park, Davis and Company and Eli Lilly and Company openly sold cannabis extracts, and the 1850 U.S. Pharmacopoeia listed cannabis as a recognized medicine. Its recreational use, though less widespread, was acknowledged in urban centers, particularly in New Orleans, where tea pads or vipers' dens emerged in the 1920s, much like speakeasies during Prohibition. These were often jazz clubs or bohemian hangouts. However, the tide began to turn dramatically in the 1930s. Anslinger, a zealous prohibitionist who, after the repeal of alcohol prohibition, needed a new target, found it in cannabis. He expertly linked marijuana to what he termed Reefer Madness, not just a film title, but a pervasive ideology. Anslinger's campaign was a masterclass in propaganda, exploiting existing prejudices and socio-economic fears. He claimed marijuana induced degenerate acts fueled by jazz music and practiced by Afro-Americans and Texans. These racist and xenophobic undertones were not incidental. They were central to his strategy. He famously stated, "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men." Simultaneously, the nascent yellow journalism of figures like William Randolph Hearst amplified these warnings. Hearst's newspaper empire, with its vast reach, ran lurid, often fabricated stories about marijuana's supposed effects. His papers connected marijuana to violent crimes, sexual depravity, and madness, using terms like marijuana murders and assassin of youth. This media frenzy created a public perception that was largely untethered from reality. The American Medical Association, initially skeptical of alarmist claims, found its scientific opinions overridden by the deluge of sensational media and political pressure. Dr. William C. Woodward, legislative counsel for the AMA, testified against the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937, arguing against the lack of scientific inquiry and the misleading nature of the anecdotal evidence. His objections, however, were largely ignored. The social and cultural implications were profound. An otherwise benign plant, with established medicinal and industrial uses, was systematically demonized, becoming a symbol of everything threatening to American societal order. These whispers in the news, from politicians, and in sensationalized media, laid the sinister foundation upon which films like Reefer Madness would build its towering edifice of panic. The public, already reeling from economic collapse and manipulated by racial anxieties, was primed for a definitive narrative, no matter how exaggerated. The stage was set, the anxieties carefully cultivated. All that remained was a vessel to deliver this propaganda directly into the American psyche. That vessel came in the form of motion pictures, a relatively new and incredibly powerful medium that could bypass literacy and directly impact emotions. Reefer Madness, while not the only anti-cannabis film of its era, became the most infamous due to its sheer audacity and, ironically, its later rediscovery. Originally titled Tell Your Children in 1936, the film was conceived as a sober-minded cautionary tale. Its stated purpose: to warn parents about the devastating effects of marijuana on teenagers. The plot, a melodramatic spiral of ruin, features innocent high school students lured into a den of debauchery by sinister drug pushers. Their lives quickly unravel into a chaotic sequence of automobile accidents, unplanned pregnancy, suicide, murder, and descent into madness, all attributed to a few puffs of a marijuana cigarette. The characters, though thinly drawn, served as stark archetypes: the innocent victim, the manipulative dealer, the tragically corrupted youth. The film's impact was not immediate or widespread upon its initial release. It played primarily on a circuit of independent, small-town theaters, often presented by local organizations or churches as an educational piece. These screenings were typically accompanied by lectures or testimonials warning against drug use. However, its true power lay in its ability to visually codify the abstract fears that Harry Anslinger and the sensationalist press had generated. Viewers watched as clean-cut teenagers transformed into wild-eyed maniacs, experiencing hallucinations, uncontrollable laughter, and violent urges directly after consuming marijuana. This direct cause and effect narrative, however fallacious, was compelling for an audience lacking credible information. For example, the scene where Jimmy Harper, under the influence, brutally murders an innocent man with a fireplace poker is perhaps the film's most enduring and chilling representation of marijuana's supposed danger. The dramatic overacting, the jarring cuts, and the panicked screams were all designed to elicit a visceral response, to instill deep-seated fear. Experts in film studies and public health agree that Reefer Madness deliberately employed elements of the popular exploitation film genre, which thrived on sensationalizing social issues for profit, often by pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable on screen. The film leaned heavily into moral panic tropes, using exaggerated violence and sexual themes to both attract audiences and reinforce its purported message. The hypnotic flicker of the silver screen transformed abstract societal anxieties into concrete, terrifying images. It didn't merely reflect public fear, it actively shaped and amplified it, embedding a distorted reality into the collective consciousness. For an audience accustomed to cinema as a storyteller, Reefer Madness served as a chilling, albeit fictional, document of a terrifying social threat, leaving an indelible mark that would influence drug policy and public perception for decades. The power of Reefer Madness lay not merely in its sensationalism, but in its strategic deployment of emotional triggers, particularly targeting the primal fear of parents for their children. The film meticulously constructed a scenario designed to elicit maximum alarm, casting innocent youth as vulnerable prey to an insidious drug. Scenes depicting maternal despair and societal breakdown became core tenets of its persuasive, albeit deceptive, narrative. At its heart, Reefer Madness is the story of Mary, a bright, cheerful high school student whose life is irrevocably shattered after encountering marijuana. Her transformation from a wholesome, piano-playing girl to a frantic, hallucinating wreck epitomized the film's central message: that a single encounter with the devil weed was enough to destroy a promising life. The narrative arc, culminating in Mary's descent into madness and ultimate institutionalization, was a deliberate and calculated tactic to horrify parents. It presented a worst-case scenario with an unrelenting hyperbolic intensity. Consider the role of May Coleman, the tragic figure whose child is killed in an accident while she is under the influence of marijuana. Her poignant cries and the vivid depiction of her grief were not just dramatic flair, they served as a stark warning. The film directly linked marijuana use to negligence, demonstrating how it could lead to the ultimate parental nightmare, the death of a child. This specific storyline aimed to tap into the deepest anxieties of the adult audience, framing marijuana not just as a personal vice, but as a threat to the very fabric of the family unit. The film's impact was further amplified by its presentation, often introduced by local community leaders or law enforcement. Reefer Madness was framed as an essential public service announcement. These introductions often underscored the film's truthfulness and the urgent need for communities to protect their youth. This context transformed a B-movie into a credible educational tool in the eyes of many, giving its exaggerated claims an air of authenticity. For example, some screenings included live testimonials from individuals claiming to be reformed drug users, further solidifying the film's authority. This calculated use of emotional manipulation, combined with the film's theatrical distribution, created a palpable sense of alarm across the nation. Mothers, fearing their children would become the next Jimmy or Mary, found their anxieties validated and amplified. The cinematic portrayal of societal collapse with youth lost to drug-induced depravity cemented marijuana as a paramount threat in the public imagination. It was this deep emotional resonance, a mother's despair transmuted into a nation's alarm, that transformed Reefer Madness from a mere film into a powerful, enduring symbol of manufactured panic, shaping public perception and policy for generations. The effectiveness of Reefer Madness as propaganda stemmed from its potent combination of societal anxieties, visual spectacle, and a profound lack of counter-narrative. The absence of credible, widely accessible information about cannabis allowed the film's exaggerated claims to take root in the public consciousness, shaping opinions and influencing policy for decades to come. Propaganda, by definition, is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Reefer Madness perfectly embodied this definition. Its fundamental flaw was its deliberate misrepresentation of reality. Scientific literature, even in the 1930s, did not support the film's outrageous assertions. The 1944 LaGuardia Committee report, for example, a comprehensive study conducted by the New York Academy of Medicine at the behest of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, concluded that marijuana did not cause violence, insanity, or addiction. This report directly contradicted nearly every claim made by Anslinger and dramatized in Reefer Madness. However, this scientific finding was largely suppressed and dismissed by federal authorities, underscoring the political rather than scientific nature of the anti-cannabis campaign. The film's impact was further solidified by its distribution strategy. Rather than a mainstream release, it found its audience through educational circuits and special screenings. This created a perception of the film as a public service message, further legitimizing its content. Imagine a newsreel segment from 1937, where a stern-faced narrator warns of the burgeoning marijuana menace, followed by clips of the very film he's endorsing. This interwoven media strategy blurred the lines between fact and fiction, presenting the film's narrative as an undeniable truth. This approach meant that audiences were often primed to believe what they were seeing, reinforcing pre-existing biases and anxieties. The sour taste of this propaganda lingered, impacting subsequent drug policy. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, the cornerstone of federal prohibition, cited public safety concerns that were largely fueled by the very narratives perpetuated by films like Reefer Madness. Expert testimony and scientific data were consistently downplayed or ignored in favor of sensationalist anecdotes and moral panic. This legacy of misrepresentation continued into later drug legislation, including the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which classified cannabis as a Schedule I drug, indicating a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use, a classification that still reflects the enduring influence of early propaganda. Ultimately, Reefer Madness stands as a stark reminder of the corrosive power of propaganda. It demonstrates how manufactured fear, amplified through persuasive media, can warp societal understanding, override scientific consensus, and embed deeply harmful misconceptions that persist for generations, leading to real-world consequences and enduring social injustice. The echoes of Reefer Madness reverberated far beyond the 1930s, casting a long, enduring shadow over public perception and legislative action regarding cannabis. The film's exaggerated portrayal of marijuana's effects became indelibly etched into the American collective consciousness, contributing to a pervasive stigma that hindered rational discussion and scientific inquiry for generations. Even as scientific understanding of cannabis evolved, popular culture and public policy often remained tethered to the caricatures presented in films like Reefer Madness. Consider the 1950s, when the federal government intensified its war on drugs rhetoric. Campaign slogans and educational materials continued to draw heavily on the themes of immediate addiction, violence, and insanity associated with marijuana, mirroring the very tropes solidified by the exploitation film. This persistent messaging overshadowed emerging medical studies and expert opinions that contradicted the propaganda. For example, Dr. Hardin F. Jones, a respected physiologist and medical physicist, published research in the 1950s, suggesting the harms of marijuana were vastly overstated. Yet such findings struggle to gain traction against the deeply ingrained narrative of danger. The societal implications were profound. Millions of Americans were arrested for marijuana-related offenses, leading to harsh penalties and ruined lives. These consequences disproportionately affected minority communities, echoing the racial undertones of Anslinger's original campaign. In the 1960s and 70s, as counterculture movements embraced cannabis, the government responded with strengthened enforcement, often citing the same hyperbolic dangers that Reefer Madness first popularized. The Nixon administration, for instance, used drug policy as a tool for social control, explicitly targeting anti-war protesters and black communities, according to former Nixon aide John Ehrlichman. This strategic use of drug laws was a direct descendant of the fear-mongering tactics that Reefer Madness so effectively deployed. The very language used to demonize marijuana, terms like devil weed or gateway drug, can be traced back, in part, to the imagery and narrative strategies employed in the film and surrounding propaganda. The gateway drug theory, suggesting marijuana inevitably leads to harder substances, though widely discredited by modern science, remained a cornerstone of drug education for decades. This persistent misrepresentation highlights how deeply ingrained the fabricated narrative became, passing from one generation to the next through official channels, educational programs, and popular media. The shadows of the reefer joint extended across nearly a century, illustrating how a piece of sensationalist cinema, fueled by political agendas and societal fears, could profoundly shape public policy and perception. Reefer Madness didn't just entertain or scare, it subtly, yet powerfully, dictated how a nation understood and responded to cannabis, leaving behind a legacy of prejudice and judicial overreach that continues to be unraveled today. The moral panic surrounding marijuana, stoked by the likes of Harry Anslinger and amplified by films such as Reefer Madness, tapped into a deeper well of societal anxieties. Beyond the immediate fear of drug-induced madness, these narratives capitalized on a pervasive moral outrage that extended to fears about cultural decay, racial purity, and the erosion of traditional values. This moral outrage was not accidental. It was carefully cultivated. Anslinger's campaign frequently linked marijuana use to marginalized groups, Mexican immigrants, African Americans, and jazz musicians. By associating cannabis with these outsider elements, he effectively intertwined drug prohibition with existing prejudices, making it easier for a predominantly white, culturally conservative American public to accept the demonization of the plant. His testimonies to Congress were rife with racist anecdotes, painting marijuana as a substance that drove Negroes to play satanic music and incite violence. These claims resonated with the underlying xenophobia and racism prevalent in early 20th century America. The film Reefer Madness itself, while not overtly racist in its primary cast, subtly contributed to this moral outrage by depicting the decay of seemingly wholesome American youth. The characters, once paragons of middle-class virtue, fall into a life of crime, sexual promiscuity, and emotional instability, all presented as direct consequences of marijuana use. This narrative served as a cautionary tale against straying from conventional moral paths, with cannabis acting as the symbolic gateway to societal deviance. The film's portrayal of girls being seduced and exploited under the influence of marijuana played directly into fears about female morality and vulnerability, further igniting conservative outrage. Think of the public reactions to jazz music in the 1920s and 30s. Often deemed degenerate and associated with drug use and illicit behavior, jazz was another cultural element that provoked moral panic. The demonization of marijuana became intrinsically linked to the broader moral policing of artistic expression and social liberalism. For many, opposing marijuana was not just about stopping drug use. It was about protecting a perceived purity of American culture and values against encroaching foreign influences and dangerous modern trends. The rustle of moral outrage, therefore, was a complex symphony of anxieties about race, class, gender, and cultural change. Reefer Madness simply provided a vivid, cinematic embodiment of these fears, giving them a tangible form. It channeled diffuse social uneasiness into a focused, tangible enemy: the killer drug, marijuana. This manufactured outrage became a powerful lever for legislative change, solidifying a prohibitionist stance that would persist for decades, driven less by scientific evidence and more by deeply embedded, often irrational, moral anxieties. The panic generated by reefer madness and similar propaganda wasn't confined to legislative halls or cinema screens. It seeped into the fabric of everyday American life, subtly shaping public interactions, educational practices, and even casual conversations. The persistent echoes of this hysteria manifested in practical, often harmful ways, embedding a distorted view of cannabis that took decades to dismantle. One of the most insidious effects was on public education. Schools, often under pressure from parent-teacher associations and state mandates, incorporated anti-marijuana curriculum directly drawn from the sensationalist narratives. Textbooks and classroom discussions presented marijuana as a direct pathway to crime, severe mental illness, and irreversible moral decay. Health classes would show films or distribute pamphlets echoing Reefer Madness's themes, warning students of instant addiction and psychotic breaks. These educational materials often featured dramatic illustrations of drug users, perpetuating stereotypes and fear rather than providing accurate information. The consequence was a generation of students educated on misinformation, instilling a deep-seated fear that outlived the original propaganda. Law enforcement practices also reflected this pervasive hysteria. Police departments across the nation began actively targeting marijuana users and distributors with increased vigor, leading to a surge in arrests. The perception of public safety demanded strict enforcement, even for minor possession. Court cases often saw prosecutors leveraging the public's fear, emphasizing the danger of marijuana fiends within communities, playing into the very stereotypes presented in popular media. Sentencing for marijuana offenses began to escalate, contributing to the dramatic increase in incarceration rates in the latter half of the 20th century. For example, by the 1970s, simple possession of marijuana still carried significant penalties, reflecting the enduring legacy of the initial demonization. Furthermore, the social stigma associated with marijuana use became profound. Individuals caught with cannabis often faced not just legal repercussions, but also social ostracization. Families might disown children, job prospects could vanish, and reputations could be permanently marred, all due to the potent fear instilled by the decades of anti-cannabis rhetoric. This was a direct result of the successful propaganda campaign that painted marijuana users as inherently dangerous, morally corrupt, or mentally unstable. These everyday manifestations illustrate the true power of a sustained moral panic. It reshapes not just laws, but also interpersonal dynamics and societal norms. The echoes of hysteria heard in classrooms, courtrooms, and family discussions demonstrate how deeply the fabricated drama of reefer madness permeated American consciousness, solidifying a narrative that took generations to critically examine and begin to correct. The battle for factual understanding against entrenched fear would prove to be a long and arduous one. Even after the overt hysteria surrounding reefer madness subsided, the misinformation it propagated left an indelible stain on the perception of marijuana, creating a complex legacy that still influences policy and public opinion today. This lingering stain meant that even as societal views evolved, the foundational untruths continued to shape discourse, resisting scientific correction for decades. The film's initial impact in the 1930s and 40s was significant, but its unexpected resurgence in the 1970s cemented its place in cultural memory. Rediscovered by cannabis advocates who screened it as an ironic, comedic artifact, Reefer Madness gained cult status. However, ironically, this rediscovery, while intended to expose its absurdity, also inadvertently reinforced its imagery. Even as people laughed at its melodramatic excess, the visual tropes, the wild-eyed users, the sudden descent into madness, remained potent, influencing subconscious biases years after their original intent had faded into parody. The visual language of the film, no matter how ridiculous, became part of the cultural lexicon for representing drug use, even for those who understood the film as satire. This enduring visual and narrative legacy meant that, despite growing scientific evidence to the contrary, the dangers of marijuana remained a significant obstacle in policy debates. For example, during the escalating war on drugs in the 1980s, political rhetoric frequently invoked the specter of drug-induced insanity or violence, sentiments deeply rooted in the Reefer Madness narrative. Despite reports like the Schaefer Commission's findings in 1972, which recommended decriminalizing marijuana and found no evidence of its leading to violence or harder drug use, political leaders chose to double down on prohibition, appealing to the public's ingrained fears. The phrase gateway drug, though largely disproven by modern research on substance use, remains a powerful and persistent piece of rhetoric, directly echoing the film's premise that marijuana use inevitably leads to moral and physical degradation and eventually harder drugs. The continued classification of cannabis as a Schedule I substance by the DEA, indicating no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse, is a direct, tangible consequence of this enduring misinformation. This classification continues to hinder legitimate scientific research into cannabis's medical applications, perpetuating a cycle of ignorance that the initial propaganda initiated. The lingering stain of misinformation from Reefer Madness serves as a powerful testament to the long-term impact of propaganda. It demonstrates how difficult it is to dislodge deeply embedded falsehoods, particularly when they are supported by emotional appeals and political agendas. The battle to separate fact from fiction regarding cannabis continues today, a complex and ongoing struggle against nearly a century of carefully constructed fear. The trajectory from the deliberate fear-mongering of Reefer Madness to a century of restrictive cannabis policy has left an undeniable and often perilous legacy. This journey, shaped by propaganda, political opportunism, and enduring social prejudices, reveals how easily misinformation can ossify into deeply entrenched systems, perpetuating harm long after its origins are understood. The most tangible aspect of this perilous legacy is the criminalization of cannabis itself. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, though primarily a tax law, effectively banned cannabis, driven by the public panic documented in previous chapters. This act was not a response to a public health crisis or scientific consensus, but rather a direct consequence of a well-orchestrated propaganda campaign. Harry Anslinger's relentless efforts, augmented by the sensationalism of films like Reefer Madness, convinced lawmakers and the public that cannabis was an existential threat. The penalties for possession and distribution grew increasingly severe over the decades, culminating in mandatory minimum sentencing laws that disproportionately affected minority communities, fueling what would become the war on drugs. For example, data from the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, consistently shows that Black individuals are arrested for marijuana possession at rates significantly higher than white individuals, despite similar rates of use. This disparity directly reflects the racialized origins of cannabis prohibition. Beyond the legal ramifications, the legacy manifests in the enduring social stigma surrounding cannabis use. Despite widespread medical and recreational legalization in numerous states, a significant portion of the population, particularly older generations, still harbors deep-seated negative perceptions. These views are often rooted in the very narratives of madness, violence, and moral decay that Reefer Madness popularized. This stigma impacts individuals seeking employment, housing, or even medical care, creating real-world barriers that persist even where cannabis is legal. Furthermore, the persistent fear of cannabis contributes to resistance against further research into its therapeutic potential, despite growing clinical evidence of its efficacy in treating conditions from chronic pain to epilepsy. The economic consequences are equally profound. The illegal market for cannabis, fostered by prohibition, led to billions in lost tax revenue and fueled violent criminal enterprises. The resources expended on interdiction, arrest, and incarceration represent a massive societal cost, diverting funds from education, infrastructure, and other vital public services. While states that have legalized cannabis are now reaping tax benefits and seeing job creation, the federal government's continued prohibition prevents a fully normalized, regulated market, illustrating the persistent shadow of past policies. In conclusion, Reefer Madness is more than a historical artifact. It is a vivid illustration of how manufactured panic can translate into a perilous, systemic legacy. From punitive laws and disproportionate incarceration rates to lingering social stigmas and economic inefficiencies, the impact of this film and the broader anti-cannabis crusade continues to resonate within American society. Understanding this history is not merely an academic exercise. It is crucial for dismantling harmful policies and addressing the ongoing injustices that stem from a century of fear,